name is Dr. Lori Bradford. Right now, I'm Canada Research Chair in incorporating social and cultural sciences into engineering design. I was born in Montreal, Quebec, Canada. My parents were active in our community. My father was a mechanical engineer. My mother stayed home with us while we were kids and then went back to work as we aged. We lived in Montreal for about 5 years. We had a family cottage north of Montreal at Lac Gustave that we used to go to every summer. We swam in the lake there. It was a wonderful experience for us to have the opportunity to have a cottage in a forest and be in the lake and on the lake in various boats and rafts. It really was formulative for me to understand how important it was to have a connection to nature. We moved to Eastern Ontario when I was about 6 years old. We lived in a small French community, which was nice. We grew up to be bilingual. I really enjoyed being able to speak with others in a different language. And I think that also helped me to understand that there are multiple ways of knowing and multiple ways of communicating about the things that we're passionate about. And sometimes things are so important in our world, like water, that language doesn't matter. We share that respect and that need to protect it, and we can get those words across to each other, regardless if we speak in different languages. We soon moved to Barrie, Ontario, north of Toronto. It was my first time really absorbing urban expansion. We saw how Toronto grew in the decade and a half that we were there. That really got me interested in how we use the land around us and how that affects the different waterways. Barrie, Ontario has a beautiful lake, Lake Simcoe, with Kempenfelt Bay reaching into the city, and it's really a central hub. People use the downtown by the lake to go walking, to swim at the beaches, to boat in the summer, to ice fish in the winter, cross-country ski. It's a beautiful amenity for the people of Barrie, Ontario. I did my undergraduate degree at McMaster University. I graduated with an honors biochemistry, and it was in my work there that I understood the ubiquitousness of our need for water to survive. We need to have that water available for us to have our cellular processes happen, and also for the other species on our planet. So my understanding grew about the importance of protecting water for our health and well-being. After that degree, I worked with Parks Canada as an ecosystem scientist at St. Lawrence Islands National Park. There, I studied the creatures that depend on the river and depend on the islands, and the people that enjoy tourism there, the people that live there, enjoy the flow and the rhythm of the river. I wanted to pursue more education on human impacts to different ecosystems. Having coming from a natural science background in biochemistry, I had missed out on more of the human sciences and how we develop relationships with each other and with the world around us. So I continued my Master's of Environmental Studies at Lakehead University in Northern Ontario. And in that master's, I did a hidden camera study looking at how we can influence people's behavior. That was groundbreaking work at the time. It's not easy to get ethics clearance to do a study where we are hiding little cameras in bird boxes and deceiving parks visitors about what we're doing with the different signs that we put up on the park. So that really rounded my understanding of both the human impacts and our natural species ways of living in nature around water. I really caught the research bug during that time, and I wanted to continue my look at human behaviors. So I went to New Zealand and did my PhD at Lincoln University on the South Island. There, I studied decision making under times of uncertainty. I was able to interview more than 50 agriculturalists, farmers, shepherds across the country, and learn how their connection to the land and the animals that they work with and the crops that they grow really influenced how they made decisions in the best interest of both their farm and the country, which is a small country with limited resources that have to be shared. As a part of that work, I also looked at global pressures on the industry on those farmers. So I really took an ecological systems approach, looking at the individual farmer on their farm making decisions right through to the end users of their products. And I realized that there is that presence of others in a lot of the decisions that we make. After this, I took my first postdoctoral opportunity back in Northern Ontario at Lakehead University, where I was part of a grant where we looked at how decision making happens in the binational forum, looking at the protection of the Great Lakes watershed. And we had a very special workshop that we did where we brought industry users, um, tourists and recreationists, Indigenous community members, academics, and various NGO groups together to look at how to remediate legacy sites along the North Shore. But we made them take on the role of someone else. So if they were from an NGA, we asked them to be an academic. Or if they were from industry, we asked them to imagine themselves as a politician having to make decisions. Or from an Indigenous community, asked them to play a different role in the scenarios that we presented about water, about contaminated sites, and about how to bring back things like the Northern Ontario fisheries. And in that work, we discovered that there is a lot of work we need to do on empathy around water and helping other people to understand what it's like to walk in someone else's shoes. And my postdoctoral work continued at University of Saskatchewan, which is where I currently am. And in a variety of projects, I was looking at the same thing. How do people communicate about limited resources? How do we build that empathy? So, through a variety of projects, which included things like looking at water security in Hamakuya, South Africa, with Dr. Toddy Steelman, creating an action theater play to make decisions about flood resources with Kenneth Williams, the playwright, Dr. Graham Strickard at University of Saskatchewan, Dr. Doug Clark at University of Saskatchewan, and then a variety of other projects around water through the Global Institute for Water Security. We really developed this concept called water empathy, which is how people can relate to each other around their decisions for water protection, for water extraction, for cleaning up contamination events. And what we found is it's really important how we share information. If we typical scientific presentations, sometimes we can decrease people's levels of empathy. We can polarize people. But if we use storytelling, if we implant science in the form of social media posts, if we share our own lived experiences with water, we make a better connection and we increase people's level of water empathy, their desire to share a resource with others. In all of that work, I recognize that technical experts, natural scientists, engineers really need to have more exposure to the social and cultural sciences, the humanities, and the fine arts. And that's what started my Canada Research Chair position. So, in this position, I'm tasked with helping engineers to understand the gaps that they might have in social science understanding and cultural understanding and cross-cultural work, and in the appreciation of how fine artists share knowledge in different ways that really speaks to the heart. That's my journey that brought me here today. Thank you. I'm autistic and I'm openly autistic, which means that my brain is wired differently from others. I'm very sensitive to things like background noise, to bright lights, to the busyness of people. And eye contact and looking at people in the faces is difficult for me because I have to interpret how people look very actively. So I grew up with an older brother and a younger sister, um, um, and a single mother from the age 9 onwards. And there were a lot of challenges for that. It was always busy in our household. My brother and sister were very active with their friends or with different sports and activities. And I really needed a place where I could find peace and quiet. And I found that in the water. I loved swimming and I took swimming lessons early on. I was very privileged to be able to do so. Part of that was because we had a cottage and our parents wanted to make sure we were competent swimmers if we were going to be up there a lot. But I found that when I was underwater, it was quiet, it was calm, it was peaceful. The water felt very good on my skin. I didn't have the bright lights exposed to my eyes all the time. I didn't have to look at other people in the face and communicate. And so swimming and boating and being on or around water became a safe place for me. And that really made me passionate about protecting it in all its ways. As I grew up, I learned other strategies to help cope with the pressures of life, but I always stayed connected to water. For instance, when I did my master's at Lakehead, I spent a lot of time in and on and around Lake Superior. When we moved to New Zealand, I was very active in ocean swimming series and ocean racing, swimming in the ocean. And we did some sailing while we were down there as well. And now in Saskatchewan, you wouldn't think this is a place to come for the sailing, but it's always windy here in the prairies. And there are some beautiful hidden lakes where you could take advantage of this. I'm raising a child who is also autistic, and they have found the same love for water. They love to swim. They've swam with a competitive team, but now they also just like to spend time on, in, and under the water. My mother really influenced my love of water and nature. She didn't have the opportunity to learn to swim, and it's something that we've worked on for years. While she's competent enough to be comfortable at a beach or at a shallow pool, she's still not comfortable to swim long distances or swim in deep water. And I really felt that that's something that we needed to improve so we could have a connection through water. Beyond that, in my studies, there were so many that influenced my conservation mindedness, my love of nature, and my love of deep study. I think of Diane DuPont at Brock University, one of the eminent water economists, non-market valuation specialists in Canada. And she led this network called the Water Economics Policy and Governance Network, which at the time brought together social scientists from across Canada who were studying people's connection to water in all its measurable forms. And it was quite unique because at the time, most of the water research in Canada was being done by natural scientists and hydrologists, modelers, and engineers. And she really focused on the human aspects of it. And I liked that there was somebody that I could look up to who had the same idea that we needed to work on our relationships with water as human beings and not just how water flowed across the landscape and under the ground and through the air. I also think of groundbreakers like Debbie McGregor and Karen Backer, Toddy Steelman, Irina Creed, Maura Hanrahan, Layla Harris. There's too many to number of the great water researchers in Canada who are very committed to community-based and engaged scholarship. They take community questions and help to find the answers for communities that are looking for those answers. And I really think that shows our generosity and our empathy with others around water, that researching water is not just a pursuit to do out of your own scientific interest, but because we recognize everybody's need for water. So there are some groundbreaking water researchers in Canada, too many to recognize here, but I'm glad I have that circle around me. There are two, one very academic and political, and another one quite personal and relational. For the first one, in 2015, a student, Alistair Morrison, and myself and my great colleague, Lolita Bardwash, we published a paper that looked at the federal government's tracking of progress on drinking water issues in First Nations communities. And we looked through all the acts and legislation and action plans and strategic plans that had been put out by the federal government between the year 2000 and 2012 and 2013 when the Drinking Water for First Nations Act finally went through. We looked at those papers specifically because we wanted to see how the government was building the argument that First Nations communities were ready to monitor, measure, and be responsible for drinking water on reserves. And we were a little surprised to find that there were very limited indicators and measurements that were done. And when we graphed the different metrics, there wasn't a consistent pattern of improvement over that more than a decade of work. And when the federal government measured the indicators themselves, they tend to score higher than when third party or disconnected parties went and measured those indicators in gap years. So it really put pressure on us to decide whether we should advocate and say, there isn't really the evidence to show that communities have the readiness to monitor and be compliant with this new federal regulation that was going into place. There wasn't the support, the capacity building, the opportunities for knowledge growing, and the infrastructure in place for the communities to be responsible for this. And yet they were tasked with that, and they were going to be held accountable and fined and have these negative consequences. When we published that piece of work, there was a number of backlashes. There were a number of questions about our methods and whether we looked in enough detail. And we went back and we looked again and again, and we were so confident in our understanding, given the depth of our analysis on that. And it was shocking as a Canadian to try to understand why this was put into place without the readiness being there first. We felt it was quite impositional. It was another example of colonialism. And in a few years after that act was passed, it was actually subject to review. So I think it is still currently under review. Letters were written from various organizations of chiefs and legal organizations across the country rejecting that act. So I think that was quite formulative for me to understand that policy circles sometimes run behind what we know happens on the ground. And it reinforced my belief in the strength of community-based research and engaged scholarships driven by communities, so we can actually understand what's happening in the ground before we make recommendations for new laws. The second piece, the more personal piece, is an interaction I had with an elder and a community member in Clearwater River Dene Nation. So Elder Jeannie Elisabet was teaching me a story about water sampling. And one of the things she taught me as I went to dip a sampling container into the lake is that we need to introduce ourselves to the lake. We need to introduce ourselves to the water. Just as a nurse won't come into a room and take a blood sample without making sure you know who the patient is and you're doing the right thing, we need to go into our water sampling with that same mindset, that water may have personhood in a particular culture. It may be sacred and spiritually valuable. And so we should dip our hand into the water. We should introduce ourselves just as we shake hands with others. We should let the water know that we don't have any ill intention and that we're actually trying to help before we take from it and before we impose our natural science and engineering methods on it. And so I take that lesson wherever I go. I make sure that when I'm teaching a class, I dip my hand in a water glass first before I teach the class how to do some water sampling. It is difficult. I think for every single grant that has been successful, I've submitted at least 10 others. Our funding agencies are set up with more resources to natural sciences and engineering. And in those areas too, there's also better opportunity to get matched funding or donor funding, big alumni networks, and deep pockets of industry able to look at the issues that they want to do. But for me, I rely on relationships with communities, particularly Indigenous communities, to help advance my research program. And there are not a lot of opportunities for Indigenous community members to do the kinds of studies where we can look at both human factors and natural science factors. The funding pools are a lot smaller for social science and humanities work, and it's a lot more difficult to have matched funding come from communities, even in the form of in-kind contributions. It's hard when the counselors, the chiefs, the community members that I'm working with are also local teachers and parents themselves and sports coaches, or providing care to extended members of their family. So for them even to find a few extra hours a month to donate those hours as in kind to our grant applications is very difficult. So I find that our funding agencies have a bit of a barrier to doing community engaged research. We've also found that it's hard to publish this work, and there's a few barriers there. Lolita Bardwash and myself and a good friend, Carl Eric Lindenschmidt, who studies ice processes on rivers, we've tried to publish a variety of our works in different natural science journals, and the constant rejection and the barrier to having community partners be authors on this work drove us to publish a paper about it in Society and Natural Resources. After rejection, we wanted to look at some of the top natural science journals to figure out why we kept getting rejected. Was it not okay to publish community engaged scholarship there? What we found was that most of these journals didn't even have a policy on community engaged work. They had no mechanisms for members of the community who maybe didn't have regular access to a computer or to a legal team to help them sign copyright agreements. That was a real barrier. We weren't speaking the same language, even though we all wanted to see this work out there in the world. So there are barriers in terms of the funding agencies, barriers in terms of publishing and sharing this work. The final barrier is, I think a lot of people will appreciate, there isn't the mentorship for young women in research who are also caregivers or neurodivergent or struggling with their own aspects in life. It really is a hard area to grow your program in if you don't see someone like you to look up to. I'm lucky that in Canada there are some women researchers, but it's only through informal connections with them that I've built this circle of mentors. That's very difficult to do these days coming into the Institute. Success to me means providing the information that community members need to make the decisions that they're faced with. It also means joint action. It's difficult as an academic to remain neutral when you see some of the issues that I've seen in communities, whether in the north, in Indigenous communities in the prairies, or elsewhere, South Africa or New Zealand. And I've really been following the research on participation and cooperation continuums when we're doing engaged scholarship. And when I used to believe it was enough to consult, to take community questions back to our lab and study them and provide them with answers, I now know that it's not enough, that there needs to be a critical mass of people sharing the same message for there to be change, particularly in policy in Canada around Indigenous communities and sovereignty. And so you need to practice allyship. When we go into a project, we don't just think about what we're going to do for that project. We think about, at the end of the project, what are the next steps? What can we do together to share the information in a way that's fair to everyone? So it would be easy for me to just provide data and just provide recommendations for a community and leave all the responsibility to the community to take that forward. It's harder to be involved in those decisions, to be someone that's an ally to the community, that builds a long-term relationship with them to advance societal good. That's one of the areas that I've had to work on. Being autistic, I really like to be in the data, in the databases, looking for patterns, writing up very neutral reports. It's been a lot harder to step out of that comfort zone and take joint action, to sign petitions, to write letters, to be there at presentations, and to be an ally with political figures and Indigenous communities. It is interesting. There's a fine balance. Yes, it's my love for water. And wherever I go, whichever communities I'm working with, I do take time by the waters near their community. But it's also an idea of authenticity. When I'm in communities, particularly some of the Indigenous communities around here that I've been engaged with for around 12 years now, I can be myself. I don't have to mask. There isn't that Western scientific, settler privileged pressure to act and be a certain way. When I'm in communities, they accept me for however I am, for the language they use. There's one community that has a name for me, which means the word collector. And so it's nice to just be myself and not have to worry about doing social interactions in a neurotypical way. So there's a comfort there. And there is also the curiosity that we can all understand water through our different ways of knowing and through our different languages. Whether we have different words for it, we all know that it brings us together, that communities need water, that communities grow around their sacred water bodies and protect them and respect them. And so that human understanding, that need for empathy, keeps me doing this work. And as an autistic, we're told that autistics typically don't have empathy the same way that other people do. But that's a misunderstanding. A lot of autistics have more empathy, have deeper levels of feelings and sensitivity around issues. And it's the difficulty with that intensity of feeling that makes it hard for us to communicate in neurotypical ways. So that's a myth that through my work, I'm able to tackle. I'm able to say, yes, I have empathy for water. Yes, I have empathy for communities who are suffering around their water. And we can measure it and we can show you what steps help to build that empathy and what steps help to reduce that empathy. And so I think both by doing the research on water and by being engaged with communities that want to do that research, I'm developing more as a person and I'm being more authentic in my autistic journey. I think the name came from my first few presentations in the community as a young academic, as a postdoctoral fellow, that were way too complicated, where I was so excited about data analysis and showing the patterns that I was able to find in the data, that at the end of the presentation, one of the council members said, well, that was more words than I'd ever heard in 15 minutes before in my life. Can you tell us the simple answer? And so I reflected on myself and I really had to work on my communication skills with communities. But every time I went to the community and was introduced by this counselor, he would say, and we have our word collector back. Today, she promises to be less than 10 minutes in her presentation. And it just grew as, an inside joke between us, but also a way to relate to my journey in the community from where I was to what I can do now. Yes, we've been doing quite a bit of work with two communities since about 2011. Yellow Quill First Nation, which is a Saulteaux nation about 3 hours east of Saskatoon. So it's near the border of Saskatchewan and Manitoba. And James Smith Cree Nation, which is just south of Prince Albert. It's on the Saskatchewan River, just past where the North Saskatchewan and the South Saskatchewan River join. The communities are located at the lowest end of their watersheds. They're deep down in a basin. And most of the land use around the communities is for agricultural reasons. And so the lands bear a lot of weight from different treatments, fertilizers, pesticides, etc. And given the community's locations down at the bottom of the watershed, that meant they've become the repository. So here I am with the word collecting again. They've become the sink where all the nutrients end up. And as a result, many of the water bodies that have sacred or spiritual importance to the communities are eutrophied. They have ongoing algae blooms. The levels of phosphates and nitrates and ammonia in the waters are very high. And they're blooms that the community elders don't recognize anymore. So the elders do tell us stories about different algae blooms from the past, from when they were kids, and they could identify which ones were harmful and which ones weren't, and which water bodies to continue to draw water from or bathe in when they were younger. But now there are just so many blooms lasting so long and happening in different times of the year that the communities are really concerned. It's particularly moving for Yellow Quill First Nation because they have a lake, Nut Lake, that is sacred from them. That's where they used to draw water from, water in the summer and ice blocks in the winter. They used to have hay meadows for their horses along the northern end of the lake. They used to have sacred trails. They used to live along the lake. But the community has repeated flooding in the spring. They have repeated fish kills near the end of the summer every year. The community have no control over the floodgates, which are located just meters beyond the reserve boundaries. And they have no say in the Nut Lake Watershed Association's board, who makes the decisions on when to open and close the floodgate. Over the years, the community has also noticed trenching of waterways and wetlands in surrounding agricultural land into the reserve waterways. So the channeling that brings more nutrients into their lake is an increasing concern. The community is trying to decide whether to develop healing lodges along the lake and an interpretive trail to bring in tourism, to provide some well-being, to provide some economic gains to the community. But over this conflict about the state of the lake, it's difficult to make decisions, with some members of the community feeling like the lake is dead and it has no longer spiritual value, and other members of the community remembering the old ways and wanting to heal it. It's a source of conflict for the community. The lake used to be a source water site for their drinking water plant. The water quality in the lake is so poor now that they can't do that anymore. The community has had to dig 3 more wells to source water from groundwater sources to serve their drinking water treatment plant. And so for them, taking action to save the lake, to conserve the water, to prevent more eutrophication is a big movement right now. And any information that we can provide, any data, any recommendations is helpful to them. But we really hope that the state of that lake will change in the coming years. That's a difficult one. It's hard to measure social impact without actually going up to people in a neutral way and asking them whether this is making an impact to them. Our work, I think, measuring nutrients in the lakes and water bodies around the reserve is having social impact at a variety of scales. So first off, being able to teach some of the youth how to do this monitoring, as well as talk to elders and catalog and learn from elder stories together, I think has the impact of getting more youth in reserves interested in science and interested in the blending of traditional knowledge and science and the complementarity between them. I would say that has a very local impact. The bringing in of research funds and capacity building opportunities to Indigenous communities also has a social impact. It helps to build that sovereignty and that understanding that we can do this research ourselves once we know how. And we can own and manage our own data and our own findings, and we can advocate for ourselves and take ownership of our waterways. That has a social impact. On a larger scale, in terms of policy, it's hard to measure the social impact. We know that the Drinking Water for First Nations Act has been under review for a number of years. And a lot of that has come from those women researchers across Canada that have raised issue with it, and different letters from chiefs and legal associations against that act. But I don't know if I can say directly that it was a result of my work. I don't think it is. I think it's that critical mass coming forward. Globally, I think that more people like me doing this work is reinforcing the belief that we have one planet. There is no planet B. There's no place where we have so much water. I look at the map behind me and I think, we are so lucky to have all of these resources. And I think that the social impact there that we can do as researchers is help people understand how important the water is, not just biochemically from my background, not just spiritually from different communities who have shared those stories, but because we are all kin that rely on water in this planet. So measuring that kind of social impact, I don't know if we can do. I think about the Sustainable Development Goals and how there are a few directly related to water, and that really makes me excited. But then I look at different countries' reporting, and it's not up to date, and they don't report on all the indicators. And the number of times I see data deficient in those categories makes me very frustrated. So I think we're making an impact locally, regionally, and in some countries on raising questions about current policies. But globally, I know we can do more. I think about the leg up I had throughout my career. I had supervisors who took a risk on me, seeing that I'm not a neurotypical student. And a student who's quite ambitious in the work that I do, which a lot of people would shy away from. And I like to provide that leg up to others. When I am looking for new members for my lab, I look for those people who have lived experience. I don't necessarily take the student who's had 100% in their coursework. But if a student has been on a journey that they tell me about, if they're neurodivergent, if they're raising a family or caring for an elder, I look to give those students the opportunities that they haven't had yet. And I also like to prioritize well-being. And we do this in a variety of different ways in our lab. So we do training together, things like equity, diversity, and inclusivity training. We've learned to podcast with an expert podcaster coming in and teaching us about it. We've had elders come into our lab group and tell us their stories. So I try to make sure that those human skills are built up in people that are members of my lab and other courses that I teach. And I also try to make assignments that are very different. No essays, no lab reports, but we might do an inbox exercise where they have to role play a day in the life of a water manager in a community or working for the government. I try to make my assignments have an impact elsewhere too. In one of my water health and well-being courses, my students have to make an art project to share what they've learned about a waterborne illness. And then we submit those artistic pieces to the Brooklyn Sketchbook Library so that anybody can search up their artwork and learn about it. So I try to extend the impact beyond the personal academic gain to have more impact in society from their learning and really instill that idea of service to others in our academic journey. The biggest lesson learned is to understand different ways of knowing and to invite those different ways into your work, not just for a funding agency that asks you to do so, but in order to constantly reflect on your own beliefs and on your own assertions to understand if they apply across different ways of knowing. So where I used to be someone who loved the patterns in the data, I also understand that the data tells one story, an elder tells another story, politicians tell another story. And it's only through reading all of those that we can weave the threads together and make better decisions. I think the message there is to find the right community and then persist. I did switch different supervisors during my degrees and during my postdoctoral fellowships to find the ones that were interested in breaking down barriers for me and getting out of the way while my career launched, recognizing the strengths that I had and focusing on those versus trying to erase the autism and trying to erase the different ways that I was able to look at problems. I really encourage those neurodivergent young women to find somebody to mentor you, to help you with the decision making, to help you navigate different social situations in an autistic way, not to feel like you have to mask, that you have to be somebody different. You can be yourself, you can be direct, you can be confident, you can be evidence-based, you can challenge the different ways of knowing that dominate in your area. And doing so is really hard, but rewarding. It's rewarding when somebody invites you to provide this mentorship to others. It's rewarding to understand that there are other people looking up to you because you've done what you've done. Even though it's really hard, and there are moments where I go home and cry or reflect on social situations and how I could have done them so much better, I know that every step is protecting water and is making decisions around water more informed. I think enjoy the journey a little bit more, take a little bit longer in the water and around the water, but also do what feels right. I wouldn't have made it here today where I am if I gave up on things when it started to get hard or when it didn't feel right. So that second message I had earlier on about persisting, persist in finding those mentors that help you, but also persist when you know that a line of inquiry is going to be fruitful, and persist in reflecting on yourself and how you incorporate different knowledge systems into your work. So I would tell a younger Lori, spend some more time in the water. Don't feel like you have to spend more time with people who are creating barriers for you. Instead, find those people that break down the barriers and allow you to launch, and stay close to them. I wish I could have had more time with some of the mentors that I did. Toddy Steelman. I know she had a lot more lessons if I had listened better and spent more time with her outside of the academic setting. Irina Creed, I definitely want to spend more time with her and should make more time with her. We're both very busy, but she just has so much mentorship to give. And members of the community. You know, I'm going to tack more time before and after research trips to just spend time with members of the community, particularly elders and the grandmothers, the water protectors in different communities that I've worked with. There are two. One's from my grandmother, who was Estonian, a wonderful, persistent, stubborn lady. And something that she always told us was that it's not the whistle that moves the train. And this is difficult for me, even in the context of this interview. I don't like to be in the spotlight, both as an autistic and because of this lesson from my grandmother. Um, and it's really hard to be out there front and center. And I constantly hear her over my shoulder saying, it's not the whistle that moves the train. Keep going on your hard work in the background, and you don't need to be in the spotlight. You don't need to be the one making the noise, just do the work. So that's one thing that I carry with me. I really like those days where I'm just in my office working with a database, writing a paper in the background, or working on a community product, or a presentation in the background. It's those days that I'm out in the spotlight that I find really uncomfortable. The second lesson that I have comes from my own mother. And given her life circumstances, she always said the only person you can truly depend on is yourself, which sounds quite fatalistic. But when you reinterpret it in a strength-based way, you can you can you can say that it means trust yourself, that you know yourself best, you know your strengths, you know when you're right. And so believe in yourself and love yourself and have empathy for yourself. So I think about that, and when the data tells me a particular story and I trust in my analysis of it, I can be very confident in what comes from it, in what decisions I can recommend. And it's a book that I recently read with my one of my daughters, and it's called The Hunt for the Mad Wolf's Daughter by Diane Magras. And it's a fantasy book, and it's about a young girl who has many brothers and a father. And it's written in feudal times, in medieval times, and her brothers and her father are part of a band that goes and pillages and are known to be, violent and aggressive in this medieval land. And this girl finds out that they've all been captured, and she has to go on a mission to rescue them. And so you go along on this mission to rescue them, and every step of the way, each of the brothers and her father's voices appear to her, and you get to read them as you're going through the story. So you hear one silly brother telling her jokes all the way through, another quite aggressive brother telling her to always fight, another brother who's quite intuitive, telling her to notice the land around her, and her father's voice always telling her to go back home and stay safe at home. And while she is able to rescue everybody and bring everybody back together, the truths she discovers about her band of brothers and about herself along the journey and how she can challenge the advice that people are giving her is meaningful. It not only helps you to understand other people's language and how it influences you, it also helps you to understand how stereotypes grow in society and how you can lose your own direction when you try to take on everybody's advice at the same time. And that book helped to reveal to my own daughter the things that were interfering with her learning and her friendships and her way of managing life decisions, and how much social pressure can influence you. So I recommend that book to any women, young women in particular, who are struggling with all the voices telling her what to do, and instead find your own voice amidst all of that chaos. I think part of my autistic superpowers is knowing that while I can't weed out all those background voices, I can hyper focus on the one voice that's telling me the right thing to do.